Hello, I am Dr. Kerul Prajapati from Department of ENT, GMERS Medical College and Hospital, Sola. Today we will be learning about complications of chronic suppurative otitis media. So the main points of focus in this topic will be the relevant anatomy of the middle ear and the structure surrounding the middle ear which are being involved when this chronic otitis media is spreading outside the bony confines of the middle ear. The classifications of the complication depending on the site involved, the pathways of the spread from the middle ear to the adjacent structures, the pathophysiology and clinical presentation of each complications will be studied in separately, but the imaging modalities and the management plan remains one and the same. Hello. Today we will be learning about complications of chronic otitis media. The main points of focus for this topic will be the relevant anatomy of the middle ear cleft and the surrounding structures, the classification of the complications, the pathways of the spread, the imaging modalities, the management plan, the pathophysiology and clinical presentation of each complications will be studied in detail. This is the middle ear cleft. As we know that middle ear is a six-walled structure and it is in continuation with mastoid air cell system posteriorly and to the nasopharynx through the eustachian tube or the pharyngotympanic tube anteriorly. Medially, it is attached with the inner ear. Medially, it is related with the structures of the inner ear, the cochlea, the vestibule, the semicircular canals, and the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is taking the sound impulse from the inner ear to the higher center. Now this middle ear cleft is superiorly it is bounded by a thin plate of bone which is separating it from the temporal lobe of the brain. This thin plate of bone overlying the middle ear cavity is known as the tegmen tympani, and the same thin plate of bone overlying the mastoid antrum, which is the first and the largest mastoid air cell, is known as the tegmen antri. This area, which is the connection between the mastoid antrum and the middle ear cavity, is the Adytus head antrum. Now, whenever there is inflammation or chronic inflammation of the middle ear, especially eticoantral variety, that is cholesteatoma, it has a propensity to spread to the surrounding structures. It spreads via this pathway Adytus to the mastoid air cell system, which is the most common site of involvement outside the confines of the middle ear cavity. This thin plate of the bone can be eroded by the disease process, and hence this disease can enter into first into the dura, then involving all the three meninges towards the brain. Similarly, if this bony plate behind this mastoid air cell system is eroded, it can go to the posterior cranial fossa and the sigmoid sinus. See, these are the structures related to the middle ear cleft. Superiorly, the middle ear cleft is related to the temporal lobe of the brain through the tegmen antri and the tegmen tympani. This superior wall is the tegmen antri and the tegmen tympani. When it is eroded, the disease process enters directly into the temporal lobe via the meninges. Anteriorly, that is the eustachian tube. The infection can spread to the nasopharynx and pharynx, and infection of the pharynx can also be transmitted to the middle ear via this eustachian tube. Medially it is the inner ear. The inner ear can be involved very commonly. This bone of the foot plate or the bone of this lateral semicircular canal can be easily eroded. This is the bony labyrinth which can be easily eroded by the disease process, causing the membranous labyrinth to be open in the middle ear cavity, and it can lead to the symptoms related to the inner ear. Once the inner ear structures are involved, the disease process can extend via this interacoustic meatus and via the infracochlear area to the petrous apex. This is the region of the petrous apex. This is the temporal bone in the skull. You can see this part of the bone which is housing the inner ear is known as the petrous part of the temporal bone. The part of the petrous temporal bone which is forming the floor of the middle cranial fossa and the junction between the middle and the anterior cranial fossa. This part is the petrous apex. The disease process, see here in this diagram we can see this is the region of the mastoid antrum. This is the region of the cochlea, the promontory and the semicircular canal. From here the disease can easily spread via the interacoustic meatus, via the infracochlear area, via the supracochlear area. This eminence is the arcuate eminence. It is a pathway for spread of infection to the petrous apex. So these are the pathways through which the disease process can also extend into the petrous apex. The facial nerve also lies in the medial wall of the middle ear cavity, its horizontal part, and the vertical part lies in the posterior wall. Usually the facial nerve is covered by a bony canal, but when this canal is dehiscent, the disease process can easily involve the perineurium, epineurium, endoneurium of the facial nerve, and depending on the level of involvement, there will be occurrence of facial nerve palsy. Again, we can see this is the sigmoid sinus, which is related to the mastoid air cell system, which is in very close relationship just posterior to the mastoid air cell system. Sometimes the bone overlying it may be eroded by the disease process and the infection spread into the sigmoid sinus as a thrombophlebitis. This thrombophlebitis can extend below into the jugular bulb or can go above towards the brain, towards the dura, then causing the brain abscess. Again, this is a very important figure showing the structures related to the middle ear cleft. So this can explain where the disease process can spread, and accordingly the complications will be occurring. When the disease process is going laterally towards the extra-auditory meatus, towards the zygomatic process, there will be formation of the different abscesses like Lux abscess, zygomatic abscess near the tragus area, near the zygomatic process. It can spread superiorly, as I said, towards the middle cranial fossa, temporal lobe, towards the inner ear medially, towards the mastoid posteriorly, towards the jugular bulb and the carotid artery inferiorly. Also, when this infection is involving the part of the inner ear, membranous labyrinth of the inner ear, through the membranous labyrinth, it can also go towards the posterior cranial fossa via this endolymphatic duct or in the aqueduct of the vestibule, which is opening in the posterior cranial fossa. This part of the membranous labyrinth is extending in the posterior cranial fossa, so the infection can spread this way also. This is a very important landmark. That is the Trotman's triangle, which is a landmark which is the pathway from the mastoid cavity via the to the posterior cranial fossa. So through this area the infection can spread also into the posterior cranial fossa. The boundaries of this are the superior petrosal sinus, the sigmoid sinus, and the semicircular canals. The angle formed between the semicircular canals is the solid angle, and these three landmarks form the boundaries of this triangle. This is a region from where the disease process can easily go into the posterior cranial fossa. Also, during surgery, when we wish to go towards the posterior cranial fossa from the mastoid cavity, we have to identify this triangle and we are going via it. Now this is a diagram showing the air cells in the temporal bone. This you can see is the largest air cell of the mastoid antrum, surrounded by the periantral air cells. These cells near the sigmoid sinus are the perisinus air cells. The air cells near the mastoid tip are the tip cells. Near the sinodural angle are the sinodural cells. Near the eustachian tube are the peritubal cells. Near the zygoma are the zygomatic cells. Cells of the petrous apex are the petrous apex cells. So depending on the affection of these air cells, there will be development of the complications, and they will be named accordingly. Now the classifications of the complications. So first are the intratemporal complications, which include persistent tympanic membrane perforation. If the infection is spreading to the mastoid, it will lead to acute coalescent mastoiditis and masked or latent mastoiditis, acute petrositis, facial paralysis, labyrinthitis. Labyrinthitis may occur in the form of labyrinthine fistula, serous labyrinthitis, which is a less severe form, and suppurative labyrinthitis, which is a more serious form. Extratemporal complications. Extratemporal complications are of two categories: extracranial and intracranial. Extracranial are the ones which are occurring outside the cranial cavity. So extracranial complications include the post-auricular abscesses, like whenever the subperiosteal abscess due to the acute coalescent mastoiditis, if the pus is breaking the bone and coming in the subcutaneous plane, then it will lead to the subperiosteal post-auricular abscess. Now the abscess, if it spreads to other areas by breaking the natural boundaries of the fascia, it may cause zygomatic abscess near the zygoma. It may cause Bezold's abscess, that is near the neck. Meatal abscess, that is a Lux abscess. Behind the mastoid, it is Settle's abscess. And further into the peripharyngeal and retropharyngeal spaces as parapharyngeal and retropharyngeal abscess. Now intracranial complications. Intracranial complications include the extradural or epidural abscesses, which can occur either in the middle cranial fossa or posterior cranial fossa. Whenever the dura is breached, it will lead to subdural empyema. Once the arachnoid layer is affected, it will lead to meningitis. Once the meninges are breached and the organism is reaching the brain, it will lead to the brain abscess, which is commonly occurring in the temporal lobe of the cerebrum and cerebellum. Other sites which can be affected are the lateral sinus, which will lead to the lateral sinus thrombophlebitis, and otitic hydrocephalus is one of the rare intracranial complications of chronic otitis media. The factors influencing the development of the complications include the microorganisms which are highly virulent, poor nutrition resistance of the host and immunosuppression, antibiotics which were taken in inadequate course and which lead to the resistance of the organism to the antibiotics. Chronic systemic diseases like diabetes, tuberculosis, nephritis, leukemia, which again decrease the immunocompetency of the patient. Pneumatization of the temporal bone. The organisms can invade more easily the more pneumatized temporal bone, because there is less of bone, there are more of air spaces, so it can be invaded very easily. So spread of infection is rapid in a well pneumatized temporal bone. Now about the pathways of the spread of the disease. So disease can spread through the direct spread through the bone erosion. It will erode the bone of the temporal bone and spread to the adjacent areas. Hematogenous spread through retrograde thrombophlebitis of the venules. The venules supplying the particular part of the middle ear or mastoid will be having small thrombophlebitic foci, which are retrogradely transmitted to the sigmoid sinus to the meninges, and that will lead to the spread of the disease to the brain. That is hematogenous spread. And third is to the preformed pathways, that is which are the natural pathways, like the oval window, round window. All these pathways are the preformed pathways, which are the natural pathways. See here in this figure, we can see the spread of the infection to the retrograde thrombophlebitis. These are the veins which are draining this dura and the part of the brain. This thrombophlebitis is spreading retrogradely, first into the dural sinuses and then into the stroma of the brain, which will lead to the abscess formation in the brain. Now spread of the infection. You can see in this slide how this infection can spread to the different areas. This is the region of the middle ear. Here it is the relation of the middle ear to the inner ear is shown. This is the cochlea, vestibule, and the three semicircular canal. The facial nerve is passing horizontally first in the medial wall of the middle ear and then vertically in the posterior wall and coming out to the stylomastoid foramen. So once the disease affecting the middle ear cavity can easily affect this portion of the inner ear that causes labyrinthitis, and if the bone over the facial nerve is dehiscent or it becomes dehiscent due to the erosion by the disease, it can lead to the facial paralysis. Whenever the disease has reached the mastoid, it can lead to coalescent mastoiditis if the pus is not drained or the disease is not treated promptly. From the mastoid through the retrograde thrombophlebitis, through the direct spread, the bony erosion, it can spread to the lateral sinus and cause lateral sinus thrombophlebitis. Now, this disease, if this bone of the tegmen is breached or through retrograde thrombophlebitis, can lead to the cerebellar abscesses or can affect the portion between the dura and the bone, that is extradural abscess, subdural abscess, meningitis, and the cerebral abscess. So first, the region outside the dura is affected, that is extradural abscess. Below the dura, the subdural abscess. Once the arachnoids are affected, it is a meningitis, and once the foci is reaching the brain, it is cerebral abscess or the cerebellar abscess, depending on the area of the brain affected. This is also a similar figure showing the spread of the disease. This is the tympanic membrane. This is the boundary of the mastoid. This is the tegmen. Here we can see this when tegmen is eroded and this neural and meninges are eroded, there is lead to formation of the cerebellar abscess. Below this there is a dura. If the portion outside the dura is involved, that is the portion between the dura and the bone, that is the extradural abscess. And you can see here thrombosis of the bulb of the jugular vein, which is lying in the below the floor of the middle ear. In the floor of the middle ear, this jugular vein can also be affected. Here, these arrows show the retrograde thrombophlebitis, which are leading to the cerebral abscess, and anterograde infection can also pass into the jugular vein through this sigmoid sinus. The roots of excess include the bony defects, that is the naturally occurring anatomical dehiscences like dehiscent jugular bulb in the floor of the middle ear, dehiscent dural plate in the roof of the middle ear cavity, and sometimes the fallopian canal is dehiscent over the facial nerve, leading to facial nerve involvement and facial nerve palsy. Erosion of the bony structures due to the cholesteatum or granulation tissue can cause the spread of the disease, and due to the trauma, if there is a bony defect created, then the disease can travel through this bony defect and breach the dural plate, can easily breach the dural plate if the tegmen is breached or the sinus plate is breached during mastoidectomy. Also, the disease can travel through the normal anatomical pathways like the oval window, round window, aqueducts of the cochlear and the vestibular aqueducts. Hematogenous spread can also occur through the infected thrombus going into the lateral sinus through the small emissary veins, or the leaching into the internal jugular vein through the sigmoid sinus. Periarterial spread of Virchow-Robin is also a known root of excess, which is a seeding in the white matter of the brain. Here this diagram shows how the disease is penetrating to involve the structures outside the middle ear cavity. This is the granulation tissue which is eroding this bone and reaching up to the middle cranial fossa. This is the emissary veins which take the infective venous thrombi into the brain matter. This is the preformed pathway through a fracture line in the tegmen. There is a fracture line in the tegmen, and that line can give easy access for the disease to spread into the cranial cavity. Now talking about the common symptoms of the impending intracranial complications. Whenever a patient with a chronic suppurative otitis media presents with a persistence of the otorrhea or excruciating pain which is high grade, which is unbearable, with high grade fever, altered sensorium, toxemia, photophobia, irritability, neck stiffness, generalized malaise. All these can point towards the intracranial involvement, and we should be suspicious about intracranial complication in such patients. So to recognize all these symptoms in a patient of the known case of the chronic otitis media is very important for us. Now, how we will approach the patient? First, there is a clinical history. We will take the detailed history of the symptoms, from how much time the symptoms have been presenting, what are the aggravating factors, what are the relieving factors, from how much time the symptoms have been aggravated in case of the intracranial or extracranial complications. Then local examination of the particular, especially ear, is very important because we are suspecting a complication due to the otitis media. So it can be it can present as a granulation tissue polyp or a retraction pocket or confluent disease in the attic or in the posterior quadrant. Also, examination of the nose and throat concomitantly is necessary because sometimes the ear disease can be due to a nasal or throat pathology as well. Central nervous system examination is of utmost importance to know about the status of the cranial nerves, the mental status of the patient, the status of the sensory system, of the reflexes, the gait, and the cerebellar signs. Accordingly, we will be deciding whether to refer the patient to a neurologist or any neurological intervention is required or not. Now, definitely imaging is required in the complicated otitis media. CT and MRI are complementary to each other. CT scan usually is done with contrast to see about the soft tissue, about the inflammation. In case of the vessels, we can see the flow voids, that where the vessel flow is inadequate. At that point, we can know that this can be the point of the thrombophlebitic foci. To see about the aeration of the middle ear and the mastoid, to see about the bony dehiscence and the erosion. If there is a dehiscence over the fallopian canal, we can know that the facial nerve maybe will be involved or it has already been involved. Due to that, the extent of cholesteatoma can be known, and that can help in the planning of the surgery. MRI is ideal for intracranial complication because soft tissue is better seen in the MRI. Subtle brain edema, dural enhancement, brain abscesses, and the patency of the vessel lumen all are seen better on MRI. Now about the management. Once we have taken the thorough history and examination of the patient, and we have done with the required investigations, obviously we will be doing all blood routine investigations, radiological investigations, chest x-ray, ECG, everything we will be doing, and over and above that we will be doing the CT scan or MRI, whichever is required according to the complications, and then we will be going for the management in terms of the systemic antibiotic therapy. If neurosurgical attention or neurosurgical intervention is required, first it has to be done, so priority is given to the neurosurgical component, and then the treatment of the ear lesion is proceeded with. Now this is a flow chart showing how the management goes whenever a patient with a complicated CSOM is coming to us. So first, obviously we have to admit the patient. Admission is the first thing we do. Then along with the admission, restart the medical management with the IV broad spectrum antibiotics. If there is an abscess, we have to drain, or if there is an abscess in the neck due to the spread of the mastoid infection into the neck, we have to go for the incision and the drainage. In case of the intracranial complication, I already told you neurosurgical intervention is the first and foremost. All these goes concurrently, and then whenever the neurosurgical lesion or the complicated foci is resolved, then we prepare the patient for the management of the underlying ear condition, because that is the reason for the complicated foci. So in case of the acute otitis media, we have to go for myringotomy, and in the case of the cholesteatoma, we have to go for the mastoidectomy or ears canal wall up or canal wall down mastoidectomy. So this is a basic flow chart we are going to follow whenever a patient with any complication is presenting to us. Medical therapy includes a broad spectrum antibiotics. It should cover both aerobes and anaerobes. Ceftriaxone sulbactam all takes care of the most of the gram-positive and the gram-negative aerobes, but metronidazole is specifically given for the anaerobic bacteria. Also, cefepime is a third generation cephalosporin, also effective against the aerobes. Or if you want to go for the much higher antibiotics, if the culture sensitivity for the organism is not sensitive for the cephalosporin, then we can go for vancomycin. Now talking about each of the type of the complication in detail. First we'll be learning about the mastoiditis. Mastoid antrum is a very important landmark. It is important that the disease can spread from the middle ear cavity to the antrum region in the first place. It can be the first region to be involved outside the middle ear cavity in most of the cases, and from the mastoid antrum the disease can spread to the other areas outside the confines of the middle ear cleft as well. So here the relations of the mastoid antrum have been shown. Superiorly there is the middle cranial fossa. So if the stegman antri bone is eroded, the disease can spread easily to the middle cranial fossa. Anteriorly to the antrum are the middle ear external auditory meatus and the facial nerve. And laterally there is the postoral skin. If the disease is spreading lateral to the antrum, gradually first the bone is eroded and then the periosteum, and that can lead to the ultimately to the postoral fistula. First the subperiosteal abscess and then postoral fistula if the skin is eroded. Inferiorly it is related to the jugular bulb, digastric muscle and sternocleidomastoid muscle. So the jugular bulb can be involved to the if the bone over it is dehiscent, and it can go thrombus formation in this infective thrombus in here can go retrogradely towards the cranial cavity as well. And the digastric muscle and sternocleidomastoid muscle are important in that the abscesses can occur in relation to these muscles if the spread of the infection from the mastoid occurs inferiorly. Posteriorly there is a sigmoid sinus which can be involved if the bone over it is dehiscent, or it can get involved to the retrograde thrombophlebitis also. And medially lies the posterior cranial fossa. So this mastoid antrum is a very important landmark, or very important anatomically for the spread of the disease from this area towards the rest of the surrounding structures. So mastoiditis is defined by the mucosal thickening and mastoid effusion. It is characterized by post-auricular erythema, tenderness and edema. Whenever there is a mastoiditis, there is a thickening of the mucosa of the mastoid air cells, and there is effusion, that is this mucosa will become secretory. It will secrete serous or the purulent fluid in the mastoid cavity, and that is mastoid effusion. All these changes will lead to the redness, that is erythema in the post-auricular region, tenderness and edema. And due to this swelling and tenderness in the postoral region, the auricle will be displaced inferiorly and posteriorly. Now, if the pus collected in the mastoid is not drained either spontaneously or by surgical intervention, then it leads to the necrosis and demineralization of the bony trabeculi, and that will lead to a condition which is known as coalescent mastoiditis, which is an acute infectious process of the mastoid bone and with characteristics loss of the trabecular bone. It is usually seen in young children. It occurs in a well-pneumatized mastoid with significant untreated otitis media. It is a continuous erosive process. So here you can see in this is a CT scan temporal bone axial section showing a soft tissue density in this mastoid region, which is a coalescent mastoiditis. It is also showing a breach in the bone of the overlying the mastoid cavity, which will lead to the subperiosteal abscess and then the fistula formation. Here on the opposite side you can see the normal mastoid air cells. The black color in the CT scan relates to the air and the grayish color relates to the soft tissue density. Management of the mastoiditis requires surgical or the medical treatment, but it should be started aggressively and promptly. IV antibiotics should be started along with the mastectomy and the removal of the necrotic wound. If there is a presence of a cholesteatoma, then the corresponding surgery to address the cholesteatoma should be done. Subperiosteal abscess is a very common condition, occurs when the infectious process within the mastoid hair cells will extend into the subperiosteal space. The mucopurulent material loculated in the mastoid antrum and the contiguous hair cells of the temporal bone can lead to the retrograde thrombophlebitis, edema and cellulitis of the soft tissues overlying the mastoid. This edema and cellulitis of the soft tissues overlying the mastoid presents as the subperiosteal abscess with the retroauricular pain, swelling and induration. This is the figure showing the postauricular abscess which is present behind the ear, and the pinna is pushed forward and downward. Again here this photo is taken from the back, showing the swelling in the region of the left postauricular region and the displacement of the pinna as compared to the right side normal pinna. The clinical features include fever, malaise, which are the constitutional symptoms, the auricle protruding inferiorly and laterally, blunting of the postauricular crease, fluctuant erythematous tender area behind the ear. CT scan with contrast demonstrates an abscess or a cortical defect, as I showed you in the previous CT scan as well. The bone overlying the mastoid will be eroded. This is the bone overlying the mastoid cavity which is eroded. The management includes drainage of the abscess and then addressing the underlying condition of the cholesteatoma or the chronic infection. This figure shows the different types of the cells and the corresponding abscess, localized abscess occurring corresponding to these hair cells. Whenever there is an infection of the mastoid antrum and then the mastoid hair cell system, these can spread into the adjacent hair cells as well. Zygomatic cells, if involved, there will be abscess in this zygomatic region known as a zygomatic abscess. If the parapharyngeal, retropharyngeal abscesses can occur if this infection goes medially into the parapharyngeal and retropharyngeal space through the peritubal cells which are surrounding the eustachian tube. Basalt abscess occur if the mastoid tip cells are involved. Subperiosteal abscess, I already told you, the lateral wall of the mastoid is breached, and the cells near the meatus are, if involved, then there will be a lux or the meatal abscess. So another thing is the basalt and the Citley's abscess. Basalt's abscess is the neck swelling over the sternocleidomastoid muscle. This is the tip of the mastoid. This is the pus located in the mastoid, which through the mastoid tip, through the attachment of the sternocleidomastoid over the mastoid process, can spread along the sternocleidomastoid muscle and towards the posterior belly of the digastric it can reach. So whenever the neck swelling over the sternocleidomastoid muscle along with the active ear infection is there, we should be suspecting the basalt abscess. If the posterior belly of the digastric region is involved, then it is now Citley's abscess. Now basalt abscess, as I told you, if the mastoid cortex at the tip it is violated, it presents as a tender, deep, poorly defined mass in the level 2 region of the neck. The levels of the lymph node we will be studying in the lecture pertaining to the neck. Usually it is found in older children and adults, in which the hematization, there is extensive hematization of the mastoid tip so that it can be easily eroded. And also basalt abscess can occur even if the mastoid cortex is involved through the mastoid vein phlebitis, so the infection spreading through the veins. This is a tender neck abscess at the region of the mastoid tip with basalt abscess. This is the basalt abscess along with the subperiosteal abscess in this figure. Diagnosis is done by the contrast enhanced CT scan, and we can see a rim enhancing lesion with the surrounding inflammation and the bohea dehiscence at the tip of the mastoid. Management includes the same IV antibiotics, incision and drainage of the abscess, and management of the underlying condition. Lux abscess is occurring deep to the temporalis muscle from the infection which is coming from the middle ear into the EAC and then into the region near the meatus. From the region near the meatus, it can go anteriorly in the region of the zygomatic process up to the spread up to the temporalis fossa through a pneumatized zygomatic arch. So it will lead to a zygomatic abscess, and through the basalt abscess, if the pus is reaching the digastric muscle, then it is a Citalese abscess. So this figure very nicely shows the regions of the zygomatic abscess, lux abscess, basalt abscess and Citalese abscess, which are the common abscesses occurring in relation to the subperiosteal abscess of the mastoid. Now going forward to another complication, which is a labyrinthitis. Labyrinthitis first occurs through a the preceding condition before the occurrence of the labyrinthitis is a labyrinthine fistula. That is, the bone of the labyrinth is eroded. As we all know that the inner ear is made of the bony and the membranous labyrinth. Bony labyrinth is covering the membranous labyrinth. Whenever this bony labyrinth is eroded by the disease process, then the condition is said to be a labyrinthine fistula. And it is said that it occurs in the 7% of the patients of the chronic otitis with cholesteatoma. As a result of this location near the antrum, the dome of the horizontal semicircular canal is the most commonly involved portion for labyrinthine fistula. This point has to be remembered. This is the anatomy of the temporal bone from the lateral side. This is the tympanic part. This is the middle ear cavity seen from the lateral side, malleus, incus and the stapes, 3 ossicles. Here we can see the round window, and this is the course of the facial nerve. This is the first genu at the level of the geniculate ganglion, running horizontally below the lateral semicircular canal, and in the fallopian canal takes a turn at the second genu and turns vertically and comes out through the stylomastoid foramen and then enters the parotid gland and branches into its 5 branches. This is the region of the mastoid antrum, which is a very important region for the spread of the infection and leading to complications. This is the region of the sigmoid sinus, which is involved very commonly if the mastoid infection going backward into the region of the sinus, and it can also be involved to the infection spreading through the emissary veins. These are the 3 semicircular canals which are schematically shown here. This is the lateral semicircular canal, posterior and the superior semicircular canal. So we can see that lateral semicircular canal is pointing laterally and it is very proximal, very near to the facial nerve and to the mastoid hair cell system. So whenever the disease process is reaching the mastoid hair cell system, it is very easy for the process to erode the bone over this lateral semicircular canal and cause the labyrinthine fistula. So this anatomy to understand the formation of the labyrinthine fistula is very necessary. Cochlear fistula are the fistula occurring in the region of the cochlea. They are associated with the incidence of the sensory neural hearing loss due to the affection of the membranous cochlea whenever the bone over it is eroded. Erosion of the otic capsule occurs here by the presence of the active mediators in this cholesteatoma matrix, and also it can occur due to the pressure of the cholesteatoma, which lead to the osteolysis and the erosion of the bone over the labyrinth. Also if there is a presence of the granulations in the middle ear by the release of the inflammatory mediators, this bone can be eroded, and labyrinthine fistula can also occur due to this. This is the intraoperative picture of the labyrinth horizontal semicircular canal fistula. Here the procedure which is undergoing is a mastoidectomy. Here we can see the horizontal semicircular canal which is present in the floor of the mastoid antrum, and the bone over the ivory white bone over the horizontal semicircular canal is eroded, and we can see the membranous portion of the canal, which is a fistula of the horizontal semicircular canal. Diagnosis of this labyrinthine fistula is made by a presence of symptoms of the vertigo and a positive fistula test on clinical examination. Patients usually present with periodic vertigo and a significant disequilibrium. What is the fistula test? It is due to the transmission of the air pressure changes from the external ear to the labyrinth on applying pressure over the triggers. We are transmitting the pressure of the external ear into the labyrinth. In a normal person like you or me, whenever this test is done, then we will not have any symptoms like vertigo or the movements of the eyes, that is nystagmus. But whenever the patient is having a breach of the bone or the lateral semicircular canal, this pressure is transmitted to the lateral semicircular canal, and which will lead to the presence of the horizontal nystagmus, or if the vertical semicircular canal is involved, posterior or superior semicircular canal is involved, then it will lead to vertical nystagmus. On the patient will have a sensation of the giddiness or vertigo. So this is a fistula sign. If the patient is having a symptom or if the nystagmus is present, then fistula sign, a fistula test is said to be positive. What is a Tullio phenomenon? In the labyrinthine patients with labyrinthine fistula, whenever there is a loud sound, there is a creation of the pressure in the middle ear cavity. This pressure will be transmitted to the labyrinth, which is not having any covering bone over it, and patient will experience a momentary vertigo. So this phenomena is known as a Tullio phenomena. It is an important one-liner and important MCQ as well. Also, we have to remember that in some cases, fistula test can be falsely positive. That is in syphilis, or if the stapes bone is hypermobile, or if there is the Valsalva induced vertigo. That can be falsely negative. That is, even if the patient is having a labyrinthine fistula, patient will not experience any symptom or not show any nystagmus. If there is a dead labyrinth, if there is a cholesteatoma matrix covering the fistula, or there is an inadequate spilling of the speculum in the meatus. Now the pressure given during the fistula sign, a fistula test, it can be done by the intermittent tragal pressure, or we can use a Siegel speculum. Both the methods can be done. Management of the labyrinthine fistula includes two criteria. That is, if there is a small fistula less than 2 mm involving the labyrinth, then it can be removed safely. But if there is a large fistula encountered during surgery, then matrix over the fistula, that if there is a cholesteatoma matrix over the fistula, it is kept there and there, and the remaining bony defect is covered with the bone pate and fascia. Then later, second look surgery can be done to remove the remaining cholesteatoma matrix after 1 or 2 years. So this is a diagram showing the covering of the fistula with the fascia and bone pate. This is the lateral semicircular canal. The overlying bone over it here is eroded. That is the site of the fistula. Bone pate is kept, over which the fascia is kept, and the sealing of the site of the labyrinthine fistula is done. Further, through the labyrinthine fistula, if the infection is spreading into the labyrinth and causing inflammation of the labyrinth of the inner ear, then it can lead to labyrinthitis. It can be of two types, serous and suppurative labyrinthitis. Serous labyrinthitis is labyrinthine inflammation without pus, and it is a serous acellular precipitate is present in the labyrinth. Bacterial exotoxins can enter the inner ear via the oval or round window or through the labyrinthine fistula and cause labyrinthitis. It is a self-limiting condition usually. It is a damage which is occurring during this serous type of the labyrinthitis is self-limiting, and there is a partial loss of hearing. In case of a suppurative labyrinthitis, it is the direct spread of the infection or the pus entering into the labyrinth from the middle ear, or the retrograde spread of the infection can also be there through the internal auditory canal or the cochlear aqueduct. If the patient is having a meningitis, the inflammation of the infection of the meninges is transmitted to the inner ear, or the infection can be transmitted by vascular channels during septicemia. This is a serious kind of a condition which will cause SNHL, vertigo, tinnitus, and fulminating and incapacitating symptoms, which has to be treated promptly. So patient will need hospitalization, lot of hydration, antimicrobials and anti-vertiginous medications, so labyrinth suppressing treatment are given, and if the condition persists, immediate surgery should be done. Now about the petrositis or petrous apicitis. Petrous apex comprises of the anterior and the medial portion of the temporal bone. This is the petrous portion of the temporal bone, and this is the region of the petrous apex. Inflammation of the pneumatized spaces of this petrous temporal bone leads to a petrositis. It is a rather rare complications. Petrous cells are of two types. One is the anterior group and one is the posterior group. The anterior group is involved to the mesotympanum or the hypotympanum or the protympanum and presses the disease from the protympanum, mesotympanum or hypotympanum, then spreads through the cochlea into the anterior group of the petrous apex, and the posterior group is in continuity to the mastoid antrum. So the cluster around the semicircular canal at the base of the pyramid, and when there is an involvement of the mastoid antrum, it can extend medially into the petrous apex. The diagnosis of this condition is made by a triad of symptoms of deep retroorbital pain, oral discharge and sixth nerve palsy, which is commonly known as Gardner-Digo syndrome. It becomes evident only after the failure to control CSOM with medical and surgical treatment. X-rays done for the establishment of the diagnosis to see the soft tissue in the petrous apex region are the Townes and the Stenvers view, and sometimes bone scanning using gallium-67 and technetium-99 is also undertaken. CT scan should obviously be done to make the diagnosis and evaluate the surrounding anatomy for any other intracranial complications. Sometimes lumbar puncture is also done. Here we can see in this right petrous apex region there is an air and fluid level which indicates that there is an inflammation in the region of the petrous apex. This is the temporal bone. Here this is the region of the mastoid air cell system. This is the inner ear. This is the petrous apex region. Management includes IV antibiotics, surgical management to remove the necrotic bone, abscess, and the infection in the petrous apex region, and there are various approaches through which we can approach the petrous apex. Appropriate approach is undertaken. Which approaches include the transcochlear approach, subtemporal or infracochlear approach, retrolabyrinthine or subarcuate approaches, and the complete mastectomy is required for if there is extension of the inflammation around the semicircular canals and the fistulous tracts are all curated out. Now coming towards the facial nerve paralysis. It is very common if there is a dehiscence of the fallopian canal over the facial nerve. Can occur both in acute or chronic suppurative otitis media with or without cholesteatoma. First occurs in a dehiscent fallopian canal within the tympanic segment. That dehiscent fallopian canal within the tympanic segment is the most common site of the facial nerve palsy. The tympanic segment and the second genu area are involved most commonly, and usually it is due to the venous congestion, tissue edema or the direct neural toxicity. Now, if the facial palsy is occurring due to acute otitis media, it is occurring in children, usually having incomplete paralysis. It is short-lived and will resolve with appropriate treatment. Usually no surgery or any imaging studies are required. But facial palsy following CSOM requires prompt surgical decompression because prompt intervention can stop the further damage of the facial nerve fibers and hence can help in the recovery of the condition. A mastectomy is undertaken to remove the cholesteatoma or granulation tissue which is in contact with the facial nerve, and the facial nerve is decompressed. If diamond burr is used to expose the epineurium on both the side of the disease segment, and the entire length of the facial nerve is inspected for any disease or any soft tissue in the tract which is giving pressure over the nerve and leading to the neuropraxia. Other otological causes of facial palsy should also be kept in mind whenever a patient of facial palsy with complaint of ear discharge or complaints like that of the CSOM is presented to us. So facial palsy can occur very commonly in tuberculosis, in malignant otitis externa, in herpes zoster oticus, in malignant conditions of the external and middle ear, and also in glomus tumors. Now we're coming to the intracranial complications, that is the meningitis. First is the meningitis. It is the most common intracranial complication. In hematogenous seeding of the meninges and the subarachnoid space via the preformed pathways like Hurtel's fissure leads to the involvement of the meninges. Usually it can also occur due to a rupture of the established brain abscess into the subarachnoid space. Most common organisms are the Haemophilus influenza type B and the Streptococcus pneumonia. Symptoms include the persistent or intermittent fever, headache, nausea and vomiting, irritability, lethargy, photophobia, and seizures or convulsions. Ominous signs which indicates the worsening of the conditions are the visual changes, new onset seizures, neck rigidity, ataxia, altered mental status, Kernicks signs and Brudzinski sign positives. Kernicks sign is the inability to extend the leg in supine position with the thigh flexed towards the abdomen. Whenever the thigh is flexed towards the abdomen, the patient will not be able to extend the leg. And Brudzinski sign is inability to flex the leg without moving opposite leg, or flexion of the neck or the flexion of the hip both occur together. These are whenever the initials, if the meningitis is not treated in these initial stages, then it will ultimately lead to stupor and coma, and which also leads to the cranial nerve palsies. Important investigations carried out whenever a meningitis is suspected are the CSF studies, gram staining of the organisms on the CSF culture, the biochemical studies. In brain abscess or subdural abscess, sugar level of CSF will not be lowered. But in meningitis, it may be lowered because the sugar in the CSF is utilized by the bacteria. Contrast enhanced CT scan or MRI is used to see the meningeal enhancement and to rule out other intracranial complications. The exudate and adhesions in the basal systems will also produce the high signal intensity in MRI. This is a flow chart showing the diagnosis and the management for the meningitis. Whenever a patient is presenting with a meningitis, we have to look if there is acute mastoid infection or the chronic mastoid infection. If there is acute infection or acute otitis media, then intravenous antimicrobials are started. It will usually resolve with the intravenous antimicrobials, and after resolution we can go for the audiometry and CT scan to rule out any other condition, and then the patient is usually kept for observation. If the meningitis resolves but there is an incomplete resolution of the ear infection, then we can go for the CT scan. If the mastoid is clear in the CT scan, then the patient can be kept on the antibiotics or chromat insertion can be done. But if the mastoid is opaque, soft tissue density is seen in the mastoid, then the cortical mastoidectomy has to be taken. In case of the chronic otitis media, if there is a perforation and IV antibiotics are given, and the meningitis usually resolves, and if required elective mastoid surgery can later be done. But if there is a cholesteatoma, which is an actively eroding cholesteatoma, then surgery has to be done. In case of a perforation, if the on IV antimicrobials meningitis is not resolving completely, if there is only a partial resolution, then also we have to go for urgent mastoid surgery. So in case of the cholesteatoma or in case of a partial resolution, we will be going for surgery. Otherwise, we will be observing the patient after giving IV antibiotics. Another complication is a brain abscess. Brain abscess is a focal suppurative process within the brain parenchyma surrounded by a region of encephalitis. It is usually secondary to otitis media and is the second most intracranial complication. It exclusively results from chronic otitis media. It cannot result from the acute process. It is a chronic process. Cerebrum is more commonly involved than cerebellum, and this, whenever there is a formation of the brain abscess, there will be a permanent neurological sequelae. Hematogenous extension can occur due to thrombophlebitis, or a temporal lobe abscess can also be formed by the erosion of the tegmen, tympani or tegmen enteri. These are the stages of the brain abscess. First is the stage of the invasion, that is early cerebritis, when the organisms are starting to invade the brain parenchyma. It takes 1 to 3 days following the inoculation of the organisms in the brain parenchyma. The changes that are occurring during this stage are perivascular inflammatory response surrounding a necrotic center, that is in the center the organisms are the inflammatory debris creating inflammation, and the debris is collecting in the center, and the surrounding there is a perivascular active inflammatory zone. Second stage is a late cerebritis, which is a localization or quiescent abscess, that now the there is no active inflammation, that is 4 to 10 days after inoculation there will be a well-formed necrotic center, and now the peripheral zone will start healing, so there will be new vascularity in the periphery of the necrotic zone. Then the third stage is the early capsule formation, which will be occurring after 10 to 13 days, and here there will be a well-developed layer of fibroblasts, which will lead to fibrosis of that particular part of the portion of the brain parenchyma where the abscess has occurred. And fourth is the last and the late capsule formation stage, which will occur after 14 days of inoculation, and here the entire capsule will be thickened and the area will become fibrotic. That area will be the non-functioning area of the brain. Now here we can see that brain abscess. Now another kind of abscess, that is epidural abscess. Epidural abscess is an abscess occurring superficial to the dura, that is between the first layer of the meninges, that is the dura mater, and the bone. It is the epidural space is a potential space between this dura mater and the bone of the intracranial cavity. Here, when there is the organisms inoculate here, there will be formation of the granulation tissue, and abscess formation can occur here as well. Whenever there is an abscess in the epidural space, the organisms can erode this bone of the intracranial cavity and produce a subperiosteal abscess here. And whenever such an abscess is occurring in the frontal region, it is known as a Potts-Puffy tumor. Here in this MRI, we can see epidural abscess. This is the dura mater, this is the bone, and this hyperintense region is the region of the brain abscess. Now subdural abscess, it is a formation of the abscess between the dura and the arachnoid, that is below the dura mater. It is a collection of this pus between dura mater and arachnoid mater, and this space is divided into several large anatomical compartments, and wherever the development of the abscess is occurring, depending on the location, the sequelae will occur. We can see here the pathophysiology. Whenever there is an otitis media, there can be either erosion of a tegmen, brain abscess, or thrombophlebitis. Whenever there is the erosion of the tegmen, then second thing is, once the tegmen is eroded, the dura will start eroding. So erosion of the tegmen and erosion of the dura will lead to infection in the subdural space. Similarly, brain abscess occurring through the direct erosion, whenever this or the brain abscess due to venous spread, whenever ruptures, will lead to infection in the subdural space, and due to the retrograde thrombophlebitis, infection can reach the subdural space, and here it will create an expanding mass lesion, that is a subdural abscess or subdural empyema. This is the diagram showing the abscess below the dura mater, between the dura and the arachnoid. It is the least common complication, and it is usually caused by non-hemolytic streptococci. Again, this is a figure showing the dura. This is the tegmen. This is the bone of the tegmen plate, tegmen tympani, which is the roof of the middle ear and the antrum. Between the tegmen and the dura, this lesion is occurring. This is the extradural abscess. Whenever similar lesion is occurring between the dura of the lateral sinus and the sinus plate, it is also known as a perisinus abscess. Clinical features of these subdural abscess are the encephalitic stage, quiescent or latent stage, then is the return of the acute symptoms, and finally the abscess ruptures, and due to the rupture of the abscess, the organisms are released into the surrounding region, and they may further spread to other areas. Management of the brain abscess is a MRI is a modality of the choice because it will be showing a better soft tissue imaging, better soft tissue density, and obviously whenever there is an abscess, either epidural, subdural, or brain abscess, it is a surgical emergency. So emergency drainage of the abscess with the high dose, higher antibiotics is the treatment of the choice. Once the patient is stabilized neurologically, then only we will be looking for the treatment of the underlying ear disease condition. This image shows MRI of the right patient having a right cerebellar abscess. This is a hypointense zone surrounded by a rim of the hyperintensity. This is a cerebellar abscess on the right side. Here also we can see it is hyperintense on the T2 weighted images. This is similar abscess on the temporal region. This is a CT scan showing the abscess in the temporal region. In the CT scan, abscesses have a rim of hyperintensity around them. So we can identify abscess on CT scan by this rim of hyperintensity. That is a brightness around a low or a blackish lesion. Brightness around this blackish lesion is diagnostic of the abscess in the particular region. Now, lateral sinus thrombophlebitis. This is a complication occurring involving the sigmoid sinus or the lateral sinus, which is in relation posterior to the mastoid air cell system. It is posterior to the middle ear cleft, middle ear cavity. Whenever it can occur either from the bony erosion directly by the cholesteatoma or due to the thrombophlebitis from the mastoid emissary veins. Whenever there is infection reaches the lateral sinus, it creates an infected clot. Now this infected clot can propagate either proximally to upwards towards the brain to involve the other sinuses, or it can go distally to involve the internal jugular vein. If the sagittal sinus or other sinuses are involved, then it can lead to the hydrocephalus due to the increase in the intracranial pressure. Now, understanding about the pathophysiology of this lateral sinus thrombophlebitis. Acute otitis media or chronic otitis media both can cause erosion of the bone covering the sigmoid sinus. That is the bone which is forming the posterior wall of the mastoid air cell system. Depending on the immune status of the host, it will lead to perisinus abscess or inflammation. As I showed you in a figure, this is a perisinus abscess or inflammation between the dura and the bone covering the sinuses. Whenever this bone is eroded, here the inflammation will first be occurring, then it will invade the dura, that is the outer wall of the sinus, then it will invade the inner wall of the sinus intima, and finally reach the lateral sinus. So once the inner inflammation of the intima or inner wall of the sinus can occur, it will reach the lumen of the sinus and form a mural thrombus. This mural thrombus is formed by platelets, RBCs, fibrin, WBCs, all which are the blood components which are passing through the sinus will stick or adhere to this inflamed area, and there will be a formation of a mural thrombus. Mural means the wall of the sinus, that is the thrombus is forming in the inflamed wall of the sinus. Also, this mural thrombus can directly be formed by the osteothrombophlebitic extension via small venules. That is, whenever small thrombi are formed due to inflammation of the small veins, that veins draining into the sigmoid sinus, they form these thrombi combine to form a large mural thrombus in the sigmoid sinus. And this neural thrombus then propagates or either obliterates the lumen of the sinus, that will lead to increase in the intracranial tension, or it may propagate further to spread the infection to the other sinuses or to the interjugular vein. Now these small venules, whenever there are these small venules in the emissary veins, they can also in their course empty these virulent organisms into the sigmoid sinus and also spread to the other parts of the body, resulting in septicemia. Now this lateral sinus thrombophlebitis once occurred can can spread to the many areas, as I already said, that is to the sagittal sinus. Once spread to the sagittal sinus, then once sagittal sinus is blocked or there is obstruction of the sagittal sinus, it can cause increased intracranial pressure in the parietal lobe, causing papilloedema or visual loss. If the petrosal and the cavernous sinuses are blocked, it will lead to the ptosis, chemosis. It can spread to the mastoid emissary veins, and they will present with Griesinger's sign that we'll be learning later. It can go to the systemic veins, causing bacteremia, septic embolization to the subclavian vein, internal jugular vein, anywhere. So once lateral sinus thrombophlebitis has occurred, if not urgent intervention is not done, then the spread can occur to many areas. This is the pathogenesis which I explained you just, that is inflammation of the outer dural wall. This is the mural thrombus. Then this will be usually occlude the sinus, and then here in the thrombus there will be central breakdown of the inflammatory cells, resulting in the abscess formation. Now this thrombus will, small parts of this thrombus will start propagating and infect and go to other areas or other sinuses. So this is, I already explained where the areas where the lateral sinus thrombophlebitis thrombus can spread, resulting in the symptoms depending on the areas involved. So diagnosis of the lateral sinus thrombophlebitis is made by there will be a high spiking fever, which is a picket fence pattern, that is a sharp peak and a sharp return to the normal temperature will occur, and whenever the graph is drawn of this peak and return to normal, it will be a shape of a picket fence, hence the name of that is a picket fence pattern fever. There will be obviously headache and general malaise. CT scan can be done, MRI or MR venogram is also done, which will show cerebral edema, reduced ventricular size, parasagittal hemorrhages, tentorial enhancement. All these are signs of the increased intracranial pressure. This is the CT scan, which is showing a hypodense areas of the low blood supply. This is the MRI showing the ring enhancement. These are the blunted sulci. You can see in this MRI. These are the area of the sinuses where there will be a pooling of this blood has occurred due to obstruction in anywhere in the path of the sinuses. Also, delta sign is looked for in the MRI, which is shown here as a triangular area with rim enhancement, that is the rim of the lesion will be bright and the central area will be low density, that will be low enhancing. Tobbe-Ayer test. This test is done for diagnosis of the lateral sinus thrombophlebitis. Whenever we compress the internal jugular vein, there will be rise in the pressure of the intracranial pressure, because this internal jugular vein is, whenever compressed, the pressure is transmitted to the cranial cavity and there will be rise in the intracranial pressure, and this we can we are seeing from the drain placed in the lumbar spine. But whenever there is a compression, in the case of the lateral sinus thrombophlebitis, on the compression of the internal jugular vein, because there is an obstruction here in the level at the level of the sigmoid sinus, there will be no transmission of the pressure from this jugular vein to the intracranial cavity. So there will be no rise in the pressure, intracranial pressure. It is diagnostic of the lateral sinus thrombophlebitis or any kind of obstruction at the level of the lateral sinus. This is also an important MCQ for your NEET PG examination. So remember this Tobbe-Ayer's test. Now, management of the lateral sinus thrombophlebitis includes complete mastectomy to expose the sinus and the surrounding epidural abscess or surrounding granulation tissue. Everything is removed. Diagnostic needle aspiration of the sinus is also done sometimes. Once the granulation tissue and infection, everything is removed, the sinus is recanalized. Usually no ligation of the internal jugular vein is done, but remove the mastoid as do complete mastectomy, remove the inflammatory cells in all the granulation tissue around the sinus, and again restore the patency of the sinus. This is what we do. Also with it, long-term IV antibiotic therapy, follow-up MRI or follow-up MR venogram is necessary, and systemic anticoagulation may or may not be given depending on the patient or doctor's choice. The last complication, and which is the rarest of the one, is the otitic hydrocephalus. It is the rarest complication of a middle ear infection. This is described by Simmons. It is characterized by three characteristics: increased intracranial pressure, normal CSF findings, and spontaneous recovery and no abscess formation. The intracranial pressure is reached, but the CSF picture will be normal. There will be early recovery will be occurring. There is no abscess formation in any of the any of the region of the intracranial cavity. So the pathophysiology of this condition is that there is a retrograde extension of the thrombophlebitis from the sigmoid sinus to the superior sagittal sinus. This will cause blockage of the arachnoid villi. Arachnoid villi are the small villi which are absorbing the CSF from the intracranial cavity, and it is draining to the subarachnoid space. Whenever these are blocked, the CSF there will be pooling of the CSF, or there will be increased secretion of the CSF, decreased absorption and increased secretion of the CSF will be there, and pooling of the CSF in the intracranial cavity. This will lead to raised CSF pressure. The clinical presentation of patients with otitic hydrocephalus includes headache, drowsiness, vomiting, blurring of vision, diplopia. All these symptoms are typically symptoms of the raised intracranial pressure. All these symptoms occur due to raised intracranial pressure. Also, papilloedema and sixth-nerve palsy can occur if the region of the cavernous sinus or the optic disc, the optic chiasma is involved. Optic atrophy can eventually develop. Diagnosis is made by the elevated CSF pressure with the normal CSF biochemistry, which is the classical finding because there is no infection of the cerebrospinal fluid, and MRI is the imaging modality of the choice to see the soft tissue density. Management is aimed obviously at reducing only the intracranial pressure. It is done conservatively by steroids, diuretic, hyperosmolar agents. Repeated lumbar puncture sometimes is done, and if the region of the optic chiasma is involved, optic sheath decompression needs to be done to prevent the optic atrophy. So, acetazolamide, fluid restriction, corticosteroids, systemic anticoagulation, serial lumbar drainage, all these are the conservative measures used to decrease the CSF pressure. Thank you. One thing is left, that is the Griesinger sign. We talked about this Griesinger signs whenever the lateral sinus thrombophlebitis is spread to the mastoid emissary veins. So Griesinger sign is the inflammation of the post-oral region, the post-oral tissues. There will be redness and pain in the post-oral region due to the blockage of the mastoid emissary veins due to the thrombi, and that is a Griesinger sign. Whenever the mastoid emissary veins are involved, Griesinger sign will be positive. So these are the complications of the chronic suppurative otitis media and acute otitis media. I hope you understood everything, and keep learning, keep watching the lectures. Thank you.